Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first distinguished lecture of the season. We are excited to kick it off today with a great talk. So let me introduce our speaker for today. It is our great pleasure to host today Hoifung Poon. He's the General Manager of Microsoft at the Real World Evidence Group now, new name, at Microsoft Research, where he leads biomedical AI research and innovation. So he's been responsible for a string of milestones in AI and plus medicine, that which you probably have heard of, going from, say, PubMed GPT to more recently, in collaboration with Sheng, their GigaPath Pathology Foundation model, which was featured in Nature last year. These models have been downloaded tens of millions of times. They've won Best Paper awards from ENLP, NACO, UAI, etc. But even more impressive is how he and his team have taken these research innovations and really translated them into change in clinical and pharmaceutical practice. Hoifung is also one of our own UW alums, so we are very happy to welcome him back to give us a talk today.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me? Thanks so much. As Pang Wei mentioned, I spent 6 amazing years across the street in Allen. I heard about the new building. I always want to see it. I'm looking for excuse, and Pang Wei, thanks so much for organizing and inviting. I already spent a wonderful days meeting with so many of you, and so it's really the most energizing part, right? Some of you asked me how come sort of like I end up working on precision health, because as many of you know, I'm actually a straight CS person. I'm a lay person to biomed, right? So, and actually the short answer is that I don't know how hard biomed and health is, right? So 14 years ago when I graduated from UW, I joined Microsoft Research. That coincided with the 10-year anniversary of Human Genome Project, so I find that's super cool, right? So, and then again, sometimes ignorance can be a blessing, so not knowing how hard it is, I jump on it. So over the years, I just have so many battle scars, so to some extent, this talk is just to share with some of the learning with you guys. I also want to give a big shout out of Professor Sheng Wang, who is a dear friend and collaborator that he actually interned with me 10 years ago. And then we start some very early exploration of like genomic knowledge embedding, right, on cancer drug combos. And then a few years ago, he told me he'd come back, and then we started to having some fun, hang out even more, and blaze a trail on a few things, so as you will see later. And as Pang Wei mentioned, like, please feel free to interrupt me with any questions and comments and suggestions. I want to start with the talk with one observation, right, which really motivated a lot of our work. It's like history shows that technology is really the most powerful democratization forces. Every one of us, if we think about it, right, we have actually much better healthcare compared to any king and queen in the past. So then that naturally begs the question, which is like, can we empower everyone in the globe to have the same kind of high quality healthcare and compared to the most resource person like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, right? And in fact, you can say that this is not even enough, right? Because even the best healthcare today have giant growth area. Like Steve Jobs, unfortunately, with all the resources he has, still unfortunately succumbed to the cancer. So can we actually be even more ambitious to say, can we empower everyone in the globe to have much better healthcare compared to even the most resource person today, right? So actually this whole talk is just one long argument to say this is not completely crazy questions, right? In fact, with the advent of Gen AI, arguably we already start knocking at the door. Now, of course, and I don't want to also bring our hopes too high, right? So, we are still very, very early. I want to start with the caveat. So some people liken this moment to be like the moment when we first discovered that copper wire can conduct electricity, right? So in some way, we are kind of like trying to figure out the equivalent of light bulb, right? We are searching for that, application. But also, in the meantime, we have to be very careful. We have to kind of avoid the equivalent of electrocuting people, right? And then another important part of the equation is like when a new technology kind of like disruption start happening, the natural instinct is like, let's cram that into our existing workflow, right? But actually the much bigger opportunity come when we were able to reimagine the entire workflow ecosystem and the business models and so forth, right? One of my most favorite example is a movie. When movie was first invented, right? The killer app at that time is like a single camera, a fixed angle recording stage play, right? So now you can contrast that with like your Mission Impossible or any of your favorite Hollywood, right? So those are some of the kind of carry in mind. If you look at our entire research program, because I'm NLP guy by training, so I like to think about what we do is kind of like trying to learning the language of a patient, right? So a cancer patient, for example, may have CT, MRI, digital pathology, multiomics, and so forth. Each modality is screaming at us about the patient, but if we don't know about the language, then they just sound like gobbledygook, right? So, but on the other hand, if we can master that multimodal language of the patient, then we can start to build this virtual patient as a digital twin. That can allow us to forecast disease progression and counterfactual treatment response, which is really the moonshot of precision health, right? Now, this is very exciting, but AI is no magic, right? So sometimes AI might appear magical because we apply the right algorithm on the right data. Now, in biomedicine, what's actually remarkable is that in the past few decades, there has been rapid digitization. So 10 years ago, this will be a mandatory slide in a cocktail party, right? Which showed that actually compared to genomic sequencing, Moore's law is actually a sucker, right? And then another big disruption, which is often somewhat understated, is actually electronic medical record. And sometimes we forget that how recent this thing is, right? Basically the past 15 years. So with all this kind of data, and we start to have sort of emerging giant opportunity. So if you think about medicine, how do we advance medicine today, right? It's basically advanced by one trial, clinical trial at a time. Now, a median phase 3 cancer trial, right, costs kind of take years to execute, and then costs upward of $100 million. Right? And you only get actually about 3,000 data points, right? By contrast, every day we get for free billions and billions of data points in routine clinical care that document patient journey from diagnosis to treatment to outcome. So if we can crack the code and distill the insight underneath those patient journey, then we basically unlock this giant population scale free lunch. Now, obviously, some of you probably have heard about this real-world evidence. Actually, that might be the minority in this audience, right? About a decade ago, when I first proposed this thing within Microsoft Research, and people are like, what the heck is this thing, right? So are you talking about contrasting with, yeah, please?
Sorry, I don't know if you want questions held till
later. Please.
Isn't there a very different character to the two different sorts of data you mentioned? Like a clinical trial is meant to determine whether or not something is safe, and the other is passively observed data. So those aren't substitutable, right?
Yeah. So great question. So the question is asking, how does clinical trial data compare to real-world data, right? So whether is it clinical trial data just measure the safety, whereas real-world data measure something else? Actually, they both observe. The holy grail in medicine is that what if? Right? The question, what if, right? So if you have a cancer patient here, given everything you know, what if we put them on drug A versus drug B, right? So the efficacy, now obviously safety profile, side effect is another part you want to measure. The biggest difference between the two things is actually clinical trial, because you do especially double-blind randomization, you eliminate a lot of confounders. Whereas I actually would touch on actually towards the end. So probably we should absolutely talk about that. So free lunch is actually no free, right? So machine learning theorem 101 is that there is no free lunch, right? So we'll talk about those more nuanced, right? But that's actually also why at the beginning but you clearly understand this, right? So but when I explain to my computer science colleagues, right, real world data, they are like, are you contrasting with fictional data, right? But actually real world data were contrasting with trial data. right? Now, the problem with trial, like if you can run RCT, randomized control trial on everything, right, on a billion patients, that will, for 20 years, that would be amazing. But that will bankrupt the entire planet, right? So the question then is like, can we, using the real world data, which is, you are already collecting them. Right now, you're just using them for billing and operation, and then you lock up in the attic. Now, if you can unlock the insight, maybe we can run much smaller RCT, run it much faster. So that's actually the holy grail we want to get. Does that sort of like helpful, right? So now for folks who actually have know about real-world evidence or RWE, you know that actually people actually have thought about this thing for obviously for decades. Now the difference is that in the past they tend to focusing on the readily available structured data, like for example claim data, right? The challenge is that you miss actually vast majority of patient detail, right? So from health status to prior treatment to clinical staging to even mundane thing like cancer recurrence, they are not routinely collected in the structured data, but they are actually scattered in all this vast amount of unstructured data. So that becomes sort of the dark matter for the RDB universe, but then that's actually the holy grail is that can we unlock that dark matter, right? So let me try to present two examples to make this discussion more concrete. The first one is clinical trial matching. So many of you know, unfortunately, even today, right, for cancer, standard of care doesn't actually often fail. So then clinical trial becomes a last hope. Now, unfortunately, even in the US, only a fraction of patients were able to find a trial. And then ironically, on the flip side, many trials failed because they couldn't find patients in time, right? So at the end of the day, that's actually a big factor why developing a drug is so expensive and takes so long. Now, as you will see later, very soon, this is one marquee example to show that even today's, or even you can say yesterday or 2 years ago, Gen AI can already fundamentally sort of like make major positive transformation here. Now, here's another example, is the cancer immunotherapy, right? So many of you probably know more than I do, right? So when you think about cancer treatment, there were the first generation that slash, poison, and burn, right? So in particular, for example, standard chemo just kill every dividing cell. You hope that you eliminate the cancer before you're killing the patient, right? So it's not very effective. Then come the second generation, which is like they realize that often cancer is caused by this kind of mutant protein domain. So now you can develop this kind of guided missile to neutralize them. That's why protein binding is so important, right? So, however, for both of this kind of two treatment, the big problem, the curse word you dread to hear is the recurrence, right? Because cancer has the blessing of natural selection. So it can figure out ways. If you are having a fixed target, they will figure out a way to circumvent, right? So then come the sort of like immunotherapy, which is one of the most promising direction. This is most likely how we finally tame cancer, because immune system is the one health system that actually also are armed with natural selection. So that's how we deal with like the COVID variants and all those kind of pathogens. If we give the immune system enough time, right? So now. Indeed, you can see some of the blockbuster drugs like Keytruda, right, or in general checkpoint inhibitor that sometimes can work miracle on even the late-stage cancer patient for whom like nothing else works, right? But if you look at the overall response rate, it's still hovering around 20%. So that's really depressing, right? And then, as you will see later with much more detail, this is one classic example where if we can actually learn to master the language of the, like for example, digital pathologies and other omics, right, then we can actually start to understand the tumor microenvironment, which actually govern how the immune system respond to immunotherapy and also govern whether the immunotherapy will succeed or not, right? Now, but we are not cracking this problem, and this is actually a lot of amazing research going on. So in the grand scheme of things, right, when you think about medical discovery, oftentimes people think about early R&D, right? So like target, let's figure out the right target, let's design the right molecule, let's do all kinds of PK/PD, lead optimization, right? So those are all super exciting and foundational. But in the grand scheme of things, they're only a minority of the costs. Actually, the vast majority of the astronomical time and cost is actually in the later stage. They're much more mundane, right? Like in the clinical trial development stage, in the post-market commercial stage, those are tons of kind of effort, monies, and so forth spent there. And those are also happen to the area where real-world evidence can actually immediately provide sort of like a lot of the positive transformation. So all these are very exciting, and then the trillion-dollar question is like, can AI deliver, right? So these days you hear lots of exciting things, right? Hypes and so forth. Then there are pushback, skepticism, and so forth. So to help myself actually figure out the chaos is I actually think about sort of the value creation for Gen AI actually span this spectrum of what I would loosely call the productivity gain to the creativity gain, right? On the left-hand side, these are the regime where human expert perfectly capable of doing that. It's just so slow, so expensive. And it's a chore, right? So you talk to those people who do those work. They actually don't really want to do this work, right? So at least don't want to do the boring part of the work, right? So then the AI can basically automate the chore to alleviate those challenges and supercharge the speed. Now, obviously, on the right-hand side, that's a holy grail, right? So can we automate kind of discovery, right, for creativity gain? So this is sort of the moment I often think about sort of the Amara's law. So basically what they observe is like we tend to overestimate the short-term progress, right? So we tend to be too anxious, right? And then too optimistic. And then that leads to all the hypes and then the blowback, right? So for example, we are still very far from automating discovery for creativity gain. But also, ironically, we also can be underestimated the long-term progress, even though major transformation is already happening. So right now in Gen AI for biomedicine, actually major transformation already happening on the productivity gain side. So let me go back to the clinical trial example, right? So one challenge is like, these are all the texts that describing what the trial is looking for, right? So, and actually 2 years ago when GPT-4 just came out, I had one of my team members looking at it. He basically literally screamed at me across the corridor to say, hey, you have to look at this, right? So it turns out that even at that time, GPT-4, right, you can just using a natural sounding prompt, and it can automatically organize all those trial criteria, including the nested logics, right? So trial, like GPT-4, look at that, and it's kind of perfectly capable of figuring it out. Now, of course, for the trial matching, trial is never the bottleneck, right? So farmer can afford to hire people to structure those, right? The real bottleneck is actually the patient, right? So every year there are 2 million cancer patients in the US alone, globally 20 million, right? And structuring all those patient record become a giant bottleneck. So here is the identified journey of a cancer patient. Each bar signify one clinical note, right? So the first time I look at this, I almost have a heart attack, right? So many node types. Also, each node has so much details, right? So, and that's basically become a challenge, right? So traditionally, you hire an abstractor or registrar to pull this thing out, that's killing them, right? So, and it's kind of a giant backlog. Now let's try to do prior generation AI, right? So typically how it works is you pick each attribute, right? You say, hey, oh, you want to extract like clinical staging, let's train one model, right? To collect some data, train a model, and then try to apply that. The challenge is actually what people call sort of like the death by 1,000 cut problem. Because you can have, it's okay if you have 5 attributes, right? So you build 5 models. But now once you have hundreds, if not thousands of attributes, and some new attribute coming up every day, then it starts killing you. The really remarkable thing is that the frontier model, right, already like GPT-4 even 2 years ago, already have this capability that they can actually structure all this diverse range of attributes. And often actually match or even outperform the best kind of like supervised method. And this is not even just for simple stuff that you can take care of with regular expression, right? Some of you might know that clinical staging is one of the most complicated attributes that you have to ascertain, right? there are this book, actually a few years ago, I bought this book, 600 pages, right? Every cancer type, it tells you, follow this instruction, look for this thing, then look for that thing, and look for that thing, and then, oh, finally, you got a 3B or 2A, and so forth, right? Remarkably, you can actually ask GPT-4 to just read the freaking manual, right? So you put the instruction into the prompt, and remarkably, it can start to actually execute those instructions. So now when you think about it, every year 20 million patients, traditionally every single patient costs you hours and hundreds of dollars. With GPT-4, it takes seconds and it costs you 5 cents, right? So with all these things, and this is basically happening yesterday, right? So then, and what it means is that you can already actually monitor all those incoming nodes, structuring all those required attributes, do the clinical trial matching 24 hours, what people call just-in-time clinical trial matching, right? And we with wonderful collaborator at Providence, we show that this is actually not a fiction, right? So it actually already started working. And what it means is that when you think about this giant space of clinical trial, right, that currently basically costs the bulk of the drug development, actually every single step is up for reimagining, right, and transformation, right? So you can actually reimagine the entire stack and potentially actually cut costs, reduce the time. And also for me personally, the most exciting aspect is that it can start to unlock some of the dark matters for the patient. So even in the US, the richest country in the world, right? So actually 85% of the cancer patients are treated in this communal and rural hospital that basically completely ignored by clinical trial, right? All the trials usually conducted in like Hutch or Mayo's and so forth, right? And those patients actually, like by zip code, you have life or death, right? But actually, there is no fundamental reason now with the technology at hand to actually be able to democratize the trial matching capability for them as well, right? And in the past, the bottleneck is that they don't have the resource to hire those acres of trial coordinators, but now you can using a GPT-4. So this is very exciting, but this is just barely getting started, right? So we are just having an appetizer, right? So we talk about how frontier models are really good with the text already. And when you think about it, there is actually no magic in the world, right? So you go to the PubMed, right? And there are 30 million papers, right? There are acres of WebMD pages. So GPT-5 already read all of them, right? So that's why they're so competent in the biomedical clinical text. However, once you go beyond the text modality, that's when all those frontier models start to falter, right? Because like they haven't seen much multimodal longitudinal data in the public web for good reasons, right? And also when you think about the text, right, they are really imperfect human translation from those original signals, right? So over the years, I make a lot of friends in the medical field. My radiology friend will tell me that they sometimes don't agree with themselves 2 weeks ago, right? So they look at the same image. Actually, they come to a different conclusion. My pathology friend said, tell me a trick like turn it 90 degrees. You will see different things, right? So when you think about it, I mean, these are some of the smartest people in the world, right? But it's understandable because the pattern, a lot of the subtle pattern, is not what we actually encounter during our evolution, right? So we don't sit in the jungle reading MRIs, right? So then the question is that can we, using Gen AI, to empower them to actually sort of develop like sixth sense and so forth, right? So then also another challenge here is like not only interpret any individual modality, but also we really need to combine all the modality to recapitulate the holistic patient, right? When you think about even the best doctor, they have no capability ever to be able to internalize 8 billion patient journey. But the holy grail here is that probably the moonshot of creativity game is that can we empower, using Gen AI to empower them to do exactly that, right? So again, unlike productivity gain, this is still, we are barely getting started, but for researcher, right, this is actually the best news, right? So how do we get started, right? So, and first let me explain why the problem is so hard, right? So, from a sort of a machine learning point of view, you can actually think about precision health as basically learning a function where your input are those multimodal signal, and what you really care about are two medical events. How would the disease progress, and what would be the counterfactual treatment response? If you can solve, you can predict those two things. If you can have weather forecasting system perfectly predict those two things, you're very close to precision health, right? So unfortunately, the problem is not so easy. The patient journey is not just a snapshot, right? So it's actually a long time series. And even more sort of like frustratingly, it's like most of the information you want to know actually are not there, right? And also, even the information that are there have tons of noise, biases, and so forth. But this is actually exactly why Gen AI can be so promising for precision health, because the Gen in the Gen AI obviously means like generative model. That is basically we try to model the joint distribution of all the clinical attributes, right? So seems like we sign up to do a much harder job, but if we can even make some progress there, that gives you actually a super powerful tool, because you can then using that joint model to compress the observed information into a compact patient representation. Then you can conduct just standard probabilistic inference, right, from the observable to the missing. And then those holy grail kind of future prediction crystal ball is basically a special case. So, so this basically motivates us to kind of start to think about, hey, can we start from those multimodal longitudinal real-world data, and then pretrain this powerful kind of like kind of patient representation that's essentially serve a digital twin, right? And Gen AI basically bring us a much powerful tool to start doing this. Now, if on the flip side, if we can start to even make some progress here, right? If this digital twin is even just like fractionally useful, accurate, then what we can start doing is essentially sort of like a population scale patient-like me reason, right? So for example, if someone have a cancer diagnosis, right, if they have resource, the first thing they do is to seek second opinion. But if we have this digital twin and virtual patient, you can snap your finger, you can get 1 million second opinion instantly, right? So you can look at all the similar patients in the population, you can interrogate what happened to them, what are the treatment, what are the response, and then you can immediately improve kind of like patient care. Now on the flip side, you can also start to compare the responder with the sort of exceptional responder versus a non-responder, right? And then you can start to interrogate, hey, why those 80% of patients don't respond to Keytruda, right? And so obviously many of you are familiar with this concept about emerging property, right? So if you have a large capacity enough model, you suck up large enough of data, then you can start to actually get to a competency that you probably haven't even imagined at the beginning. So now basically we can start to let our imagination run loose, right? It's like, what if we can actually internalize those 8 billion multimodal longitudinal patients, and what kind of emerging property we can actually unlock, right? How far can we go beyond the glass ceiling of today's healthcare, right? So that's kind of in a nutshell sort of like what are the challenges, but also what are the promises. So one of the big challenge is all this multimodal, but it's also a good news for research, right? If everything is just like all those tens of trillions of tokens in the web, then we can let OpenAI or Gemini take care of them, right? But in the biomedicine, there are two problems. One problem is that you have many modalities, right? And the second problem is that each of the modalities, especially the new ones, right? Especially emerging ones. For example, these days, like single cell, spatial, they are very hot, right? But very difficult to generate them, very expensive, right? So you can't do the brain dead, brute force thing. So that actually really motivates us to essentially organize our attack, right, in basically three kind of directions, right? So in case you haven't noticed, like I'm a sort of a firm believer of free lunch. So all I'm obsessed about is to figure out, hey, what are the recipes? And then here are basically 3 recipes for free lunch, right? So the first big free lunch many of you are familiar with, right? So this is just like anytime you have an unannotated data point, let's say an unannotated image, unannotated protein sequence, that's actually a great opportunity for cell supervision, right? And the general recipe is basically you introduce this modality-specific encoder and decoder. You use an encoder to compress the original input, right? You learn to do non-linear dimension reduction. Then you force the decoder to recreate the original input. So in this way, you can basically turn every single unannotated data point into a self-supervised training instance, right? So that's what I mean by free lunch, right? And for text, somebody already spent billions of dollars, so you don't need to worry about it. And now this is a very powerful scheme, but for each individual modality in biomedicine, right? If this scheme go out of the box, it will solve every single problem in the globe, then it will be very boring, right? But thankfully, actually, it's not like that, right? So each modality tend to also have their idiosyncratic, unique challenge, which actually is make the research so much fun, right? For example, this is really a holy grail, right, for immunotherapy and maybe also for autoimmune disease as well, which is like, why would some of the tumor respond to immunotherapy and others not, right? And turns out that there are basically this so-called tumor microenvironment, right, which are basically like the tumor cell, right, like the melanoma cells versus like some of the immune cells, the lymphocytes, and so forth, right? So it turns out that their spatial distribution actually dictate whether the tumor are ready to respond or not, right? So this is actually, when you think about it, you can, some of you NLP folks, right, you probably remember this distributional hypothesis, right? That's kind of as old as AI, basically underlying the word embedding and large language model, right? There is a similar distributional hypothesis here, which is like the distribution is actually what determines some of the properties, right? And again, as an NLP guy by training, I love to think about, can we unlock this tumor microenvironment grammar, right? So that would be golden, right? Now, on paper, we have the perfect tool to do that, right? So I don't need to belabor you guys about transformer, right? So for images, what does a transformer do? Essentially what it does is like, you have an image, you have lots of pixels, right? So transformer basically said, let's pass message between every two pixels, right? So all those layers are basically, you unroll this message, you do it multiple times. Eventually every pixel know everybody else, right? So this is awesome. This is why transformers are so powerful that capture arbitrary complex information and dependencies and so forth. But it has one Achilles heel, right? As you well know, it's like, because you have to pass pairwise messages, so then the computations scale quadratically. Now, unfortunately, digital pathology is some of the largest images in the world, right? So when I first set foot on this work field, and my pathology friends told me that they used one analogy that actually stuck in my mind. It's like, if you print a standard pathology slide, right, in using standard printer resolution, it will cover a big chunk of a tennis field, right? So think about that, right? So, which means that you multiply that by quadratic, that literally immediately kill you, right? So a single pathology slide can cost billions of time of compute compared to your beloved cat and dog images, right? So beforehand, that's actually the fundamental challenge where if you look at digital pathology for a long time, that's why they said, okay, I can't handle this giant gigapixel images. Let's chop it up into 256 times 256 tile or patches, right? Let's look at each patches and maybe put a CNN, maybe put a multi-instant learning and so forth. I mean, you can do for some very simple stuff that are just local features, right? But when you have to model the tumor microenvironment, which require the global distribution, then this is far from enough, right? So that basically motivates us to start thinking about, hey, what can be the solution? So in speech recognition, they have this idea about diluted attention. So we basically try to steal this idea to apply to digital pathology, right? So the idea is actually very simple, right? So quadratic is not actually that scary if your input is small, right? So that's why we actually use transformer to success to many, many things, right? So which means that you can, in your local neighborhood, you can afford to pass messages, right, left and right, right? And after you do that, every pixel know every neighbor very well, right? So now what it could kill you is that when you try to pass message from the one neighborhood to some neighborhood very far away, right? That's when it start to bring a problem. But we don't have to actually pass messages between every pixel, right? Because every pixel in the local already know the neighbor, so you can elect some representative, and then let the representative actually passing the messages, right? So that's basically the underlying ideas. So we have actually wonderful, wonderful collaborators in Providence, and also Professor Shen Wang here. I also want to give a big shout out, embarrassing, Hanwen Xu. He did one internship and got a Nature paper, right? So, and we want to keep hiring you forever, right? So, and so it's so wonderful to see how this actually pretty much changed digital pathology overnight, right? So before the GigaPath paper, everybody is like, oh, MIL, patch level modeling, tile level modeling. Then suddenly you see all the leading lab ditching their old kind of patch level models, scrambling. Everything now becomes slide level, right? So we are very, very excited to see. And one thing that I just want to give a sneak peek about the creativity gain idea, right? So we try to throw some really hard problem to GigaPath, right? So we don't want to throw some conventional like cancer subtyping, and those are semi-solved problem, right? We want to say, hey, what can you find a signature, right? Across 31 cancer type, right? So keep in mind, like digital pathology give you the morphology, right? And different cancer type have very different morphology, right? So initially when we proposed this experiment to our pathology collaborator, they thought we were crazy, right? So, but then we said, well, it's just burning a few GPU, right? So what does it hurt? So surprisingly, it actually discovered some non-trivial signal, at least for some of the key kind of like genes, right? And so surprisingly, for a few key genes, actually you could actually come up with one single signature that unify all 31 cancer subtypes, right? And based on those seemingly very different morphology, and still predict the biomarker status, the mutation status, right? So that's actually a really sort of like surprising thing for our collaborators. Now, obviously, compared to the holy grail for automated discovery, this is just a baby step, right? So, but what it actually really heartening for us is like it give you a glimpse of the future. So this is one of my favorite graphs all time. Sometimes if I'm depressed, I start looking at a graph like this, right? So when I started this journey, my biggest nightmare is like waking up, like we do some work, publish some paper, and waking up, like biomed people say, oh, there is no use, right? So this is sort of like kind of validation to tell us maybe we are not entirely kind of like imposter, right? So another really exciting thing is that when we started the project, I feel very good because our collaborator have 2 scanners, identical scanner, and a single team to run the scanning. I said, great. We wouldn't have that much a batch effect, right? But then when we actually got the paper out and when we're releasing a model, I become very nervous, right? Because that means like when you go out of the door and everybody have a different scanner, different kind of stainings and so forth, right? Would it actually work, right? So what's actually amazing is that we start to see some of this validation, like these are fantastic researchers in Mount Sinai and MSK. They run a global prospective trial across multiple continents and institutions. And then they show that they can actually fine-tune our GigaPath model to actually predict some key biomarker. So in fact, there is also a really interesting story behind, right? So for lung cancer patient, it's well known that EGFR mutation status actually dictate sort of like your response to many drugs. Pharma developed tons, acres of drugs that target EGFR mutation, right? So every single guideline for lung cancer treatment is like you have to sequence. You're committing a crime if you don't sequence EGFR. But even in the US, actually a quarter of cancer patients didn't have that status, didn't have that sequence for whatever reason, right? But if we can using the digital pathology, which are dirt cheap, right, $1 and almost always available, to predict the EGFR status, then can allow them to very quickly. They also have to make the decision very quickly for first-line treatment, right? So and sequencing can sometimes still take a long time, right? So then you can basically then say, I can use the dirt cheap H&E slide to predict the EGFR status, then focusing on the sequencing resource on those high likelihood people with this. So amazingly, like they basically show that this actually can work. In fact, on their holdout validation set, they have higher accuracy than on their external validation. They have higher accuracy than their holdout test set, right? So this is something that really made my day. So far, I tell you some promising kind of like things, and I will speed a little bit faster. Sorry. And this is just getting started, right? So each modality is like a distinct language. Right, so your CT could be your French, your digital pathology could be your Hindu. So very quickly, even if you learn beautiful modality-specific foundation model, very quickly you have a United Nations problem here, right? So how do you get those individual modality to be able to crosstalk with each other and synthesize a holistic patient, right? When you look at the machine translation, how do they deal with this problem, right? So they basically using a resource-rich language like English to as an interlingua, as a bridge across all the languages. So for example, you may have two languages, like let's say a sublanguage in India, maybe a sublanguage in Africa, right? So you may have zero parallel data, right? So normally you wouldn't be able to do that, but if you use English as bridge, you can translate language A to English and then translate from English to B, right? So that's literally all the commercial translation engines scale to hundreds of languages in the world. So then we said, hey, let's steal their playbook to do the multimodal in biomedicine, and what would be the candidate interlingua? Now, obviously, text is a very strong contender, right? So we already have a very strong LLMs, right, for the text modality. Also, for any modality under the sun, turns out that when you conduct a study of that modality, you usually leave some paper trail. So which means that you often have lots of another second source of free lunch is like all those modality text pairs. So this motivates us to basically say, let's do a curriculum learning, right? So let's piggyback on the encoder decoder we already got in the first stage. Let's focusing all our compute in this stage to train a lightweight adapter as a translator, right? To bridge the modality and the text. Now, once you do that, you implicitly grounded all the modality to a similar semantic space. You also have an added benefit because you look at EGFR, you look at lymphomas and so forth, right? The LM actually know like what they means. It actually have all the knowledge in the world about those string, right? So now by bridging the modality to the text semantic space, you also implicitly also let the knowledge flow back to interpret those individual modality for free, right? So I wouldn't bore you with some of the glory detail, but there is a kind of general recipe about LavaMed. And then we also apply that to radiology, image and reports. And then you can also modify this recipe to include a mass decoder, right, to do image analysis, right? So for example, if you have a medical image, the first thing you want to do is like, does that contain some object that you care about, right? If it does, where is it, right? And then also once you locate it, and can you actually figure out the precise segments, right? So in the past, often these tasks are conducted separately, right? So for example, when you use the very popular SAM and MedSAM, many of you probably know, right? You usually assume you specify a bounding box, usually rectangular, right? And then they will try to figure out the segmentation for you. But what we actually find is that we can actually using the same recipe, using natural language interface to unify across 9 image modalities, 64 object types, right? So I'm really lazy people, so I often dream about let me talk to the model and let it do all the work, and that dream started coming true, right? So and by doing all this, like we can actually start to actually recognize all those different kind of like objects all at once, right? So by the way, this is joint work with Professor Shen Wang, and we actually come up with a title segmenting everything everywhere all at once, right? Unfortunately, the editor thing is too sensational, so we have to end up with a very boring title. Also another really exciting thing is that traditional, when you do that bounding box approach, right, that actually begin to bog down if your object, if you have multiple objects within the same bounding box in very weird shape, then not convex and so forth, then you're screwed, right? But by modeling the object through the natural language and then jointly model the segmentation, we actually find out we can actually do this complex object much, much better. So again, this is something that keeps us going, and we are lucky to make it to Nature Method last year, and the Nature Method editor also published an external review that actually says some really encouraging thing for us. So all these are great, but actually there is one last, and I would say actually the most important free lunch, which is actually the patient journey themselves, right? So all of you know that GPT-4 basically learn by doing predict next token, next token, next token. It seems like a very dumb way to learn things, right? But if you can do it for 10 trillion tokens, suddenly something magical happens. Now, what if we can do virtual patient by learning to predict next event, next event, next event, right? So again, if you do it for just like 2,000 journey, nothing much happened. But what if you can do it for 8 billion journey, right? So now that's very exciting. But if you know the story about GPT, right? What they do is like they don't go to Satya ask for $1 billion to train GPT-4 all at once, right? So they first sort of like have to de-risk the direction, right? By training GPT, GPT-2, GPT-3, figuring out the scaling law, right? What is the optimal compute? Because you could be very, very wasteful if you haven't set those parameters carefully, right? So what we did is that we first using some kind of small kind of like data set to de-risk the scaling law. And then we actually are very fortunate to work with the Epic Cosmos folks to portray arguably the largest patient foundation model in the world from 300 million patient journey, right? What's amazing is that this is basically a model, right? It's already close to our dream about virtual patient because this is a model that it can suck up the history and then can basically simulate the trajectory by just predict next event, next event, next event, right? So by doing that single simulation, you can actually perform all kinds of tasks out of the box. And what we find is that this thing doesn't specifically tune for any specific task, but out of the box, it can already match or even outperform the task-specific supervised method on 78 real-world tasks, right? So that's kind of like really exciting. So let me wrap up. So we can think about embedding patients so far. We talked about embedding patients so far, but we can also start thinking about embedding the drugs, right? So like if you have a new drug, right, that's one of the challenge for real-world data. Is like, what if your drug had never been applied? You will never know anything about a new drug, right? But a new drug is never come out from a vacuum, right? It actually are similar to many, many drugs that people have tried before. So not only you have a patient like me, but you have a drug like me, right? So what if we can embed every goddamn thing, right? And then do a universal embedding calculus, right? So that will be very exciting. So I would just quickly touch on some of the very exciting future work. For example, GigaTime is joint work with Hoifung and Sheng. This is basically about how can we actually not only kind of look at the cell morphology, but what if we can also using that to infer the cell state, right? So hopefully we'll share something more public soon. Another really hot topic is obviously reasoning and RL, right? So the truth is that we run our quality token in the web, so we have to find free lunch, right? So one of the free lunch is like, what if you have a verifiable reward, then that you can generate things like AlphaGo training do, right? The challenge for healthcare, unfortunately, is that not many things can be readily give you a verifiable reward. So I would say especially in the multimodal reasoning, there is acres of exciting topic to be explored. Now, we did some tiny baby step and it already have very promising result actually on some very influential. So the team basically did some work and they're like, oh, there is this very popular benchmark. Maybe let's just secretly upload something, right? And to test how the model does. And then a few days later, they come back the result. And then suddenly we get a call from a bunch of the health system to say, oh, who did this, right? And it turns out that we basically kind of wipe out, all the settings and so forth. So it's quite exciting. And another 2 years ago, the buzzword obviously is generative, right? Last year last year is a multimodal, right? And this year is agent, right? So one thing that I find really fascinating is about this notion that somebody called a solopreneur, right? So what if you can one person run a unicorn, right? So this is actually not that crazy, right? But obviously not here yet. Like one thing we probably have to develop agent MBA first, right? So there are a bunch of things. We start with some tiny baby step in the tumor board. Surprisingly, already got our CEO quite excited, maybe too excited. I want to kind of end with one provocative example, right? So with everything we have here, we actually have a really powerful tool at our hand, which is the following. Given any research protocol, and if you have a part of our real-world data, right, you can actually conjure up a virtual case arm and a virtual control arm. And then what it means is that you now have a population-scale free lunch for hypothesis generation and testing. So now, come back to actually the question asked earlier. There are two challenges, right? One challenge is that a lot of those data in clinical trial, you have human to structure all those, right? So, but actually Gen AI can start to actually, do a lot of those structuring. Now, the other thing is like Gen AI doesn't magically solve yet, which is the confounding problem, right? So because in the real world data, you have all kinds of confounding, right? It might be just happen to only the more healthy people you assign that to the one drug, right? Then you will get a wrong conclusion. So, but there are all kinds of techniques to try to mitigate this problem, right? So to show that, yes, please.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm Michelle from College of Education. Generative AI, I'm so interested in it because we're a multimodal field. There's neurologists, there's SLPs, there's everybody, even organizational behavior, who use behavior analytics. What I want to know is where does Microsoft have any idea about the field of autism, and where does that fit into where your human fit? Mm-hmm. And where are you getting your expertise from?
Got it.
And ethics and fidelity and protection of information and experiments and all that.
Perfect. Really important question, right? That's really one of the foundational questions. So I will ask you to pause the thought. Let me finish one slide, right? And then I can get to it. The question is really a fantastic question, which is like there are so many disease areas. So far we talk a lot about cancer. What about all the other, especially the behaviors and so forth? I would say there is many reasons we pick cancer to focus on as a beachhead area. But one reason is actually that if you look at the provider, cancer, actually, you generally have enough information density for cancer. But once you go to those like behavioral or metabolics or neuro or anything, actually the data that you need for those would not usually be in EMR, right? So we talk about social determinant, but that's just barely scratching the surface, right? So, and I actually brainstormed with a bunch of students or faculty before, which is like, this is a heavy growth area, which is like, how can you actually mobilize the society and be respectful to patient to bring ROI to the tangible ROI to the patient. Otherwise, if you ask them, right, like for example, for cancer, right, like the ROI is very clear, right? So you don't treat it, patient die, right? But when you look at like, oh, what if like there are significant risks in 20 years for Alzheimer, right? And because you have that significant risk, please give me all your lifestyle, phone, everything, right? Then that trade-off is not that obvious. So I would say we don't have answer for a lot of that, but I think that's both a technology issue, which is like, can technology, if you have the data, can technology extract the insight and bring patient the ROI? the cool thing is that the technology getting more and more powerful, so the ROI could be bigger and bigger. Then the second thing is that conditioning on the ROI, how would the society figure out a social contract to actually do that, right? So, so hopefully that addressed some of your question. But let me also finish a thought here, which is like, so we really want to turn the real-world data into an experiment space, right? But if we can figure out the structural issue, if we can alleviate some of the confounder, then what it does is that we can already start seeing some promising signs. So here are some of the marquee lung cancer trial, right, including the original Keytruda trial. So with our Providence collaborators, we actually show that Providence real-world data, we can actually sort of like arrive at similar conclusions, statistics, compared to the published randomized control trial, right? So again, this is still tiny baby step. And also I want to re-emphasize that I'm not advocating that we will replace RCT. That remains the gold standard for medicine, but we might be able to run RCT much smarter, much faster, much less costly, right? Very excited to publish that in NEJM-AI, and actually end up they published not one but 2 editorials. So very excited about that. So please.
Maybe I misunderstand. It's not clear to me how running a simulation of a randomized controlled trial would save anything on. And I mean, you said smaller, but then that's reducing the efficacy of the randomized controlled trial on its own terms.
Yeah.
So if that's the if that's the proposal, counter to what you said about it being the gold standard, it would be advocating for reducing the quality of that gold standard.
So basically, like obviously there is a reason I said this is a baby step, not that we solve everything, right? So the baby step is the following, which is like, if you have the real world data, are you able to alleviate the confounder problem enough? Are you able to alleviate some of the quality problem enough, right, to actually arrive at the similar statistic? Because the hazard ratio ultimately is what you try to get at from the RCT, right? So at least that's one of the endpoint, right? So this experiment just showed that there is that possibility. So the real-world data does contain sufficient statistical information that could be potentially comparable to RCT. It doesn't mean that this is a direct recipe to replace RCP, right? So now, how would I actually, like, obviously I go out on a limb to speculate what could be the next adjacent move, right? So, but the most immediate area that you can actually substantially drive down the cost for RCT is the so-called external control, right? So the case arm, by definition, you give the patient a new drug, right? So, and by definition, a new drug hasn't been seen before, right? But the control arm, by contrast, in cancer, nobody do placebo. So then the control arm is just a standard of care. And standard of care is actually everywhere, right? So then the question is that, can you using the real world virtual control arm rather than actually recruiting all those patients and just give them the depressing standard of care, right? So that's actually one concrete example. Now, I'm not saying that we can immediately cut the cost by half by replacing every single person in the control arm, but you can imagine maybe I can reduce it by the control arm by half, right? So I can, using the real world data to augment that standard of care arms, right? And then there were a gazillion other ways that people start trying, like bucket trial, pragmatic trial, virtual trial, and all kinds of ways to using the real world data to augment this. Because at the end of the day, you just try to get a sufficient statistic in some form, right? And also another point I also want to mention is that RCT is beautiful because the randomization deal with a bunch of the confounders, but RCT have a deep Achilles heel because of the limit of the size, right? So people have some mind-boggling statistic about, like, you know, sort of asthmas and so forth, right? So it turns out that you have a drug applied to the population, and you look at like how representative your original trial to actually the applicable population is like single-digit percentage, right? So I'm not saying that sort of like we will completely do something very different tomorrow, but I'm saying that there is promising direction to actually improve. Does that help? Awesome. Yeah, love to pick your brain more. So thanks so much. Sorry, I probably ran out of time. I want to highlight all the folks because they do all the work. These days, I'm only doing PowerPoint programming, right? Just so you know. And obviously all the collaborators without whom obviously we can't do any of this. So thank you so much.
So as you've already alluded to, the model today is that you have a new drug, you do a clinical trial that is simultaneously extremely expensive but also quite small.
Yeah.
And then you have a yes/no decision, good for everybody, nobody.
Yeah.
A better method that is possible to then wasn't 10 years ago is like, as soon as you have a drug, it starts getting tried by whoever wants to within some parameters, and then it's continuously tested forever.
Yep. Yep.
New personalizations found, new off labels, etc., etc.
Yep.
So the question is, do you agree with this, which you seem to, but then what are the barriers to making this happen, and how do you overcome it?
Yeah. So Martin Tannenbaum is one of the first kind of AI person who starts say, look, the trial is still in the sort of the very rigid kind of statistic era, right? So the experiment design in the simplest experiment design. So can AI overcome some of the rigid kind of limitation and because all we try to do is to talk to the nature and extract information, right? So unfortunately, talk to a human body is very expensive and also have all kinds of ethical problems, right? So then can we maximize the information we can get, right? So I think there are already some of the idea. Now that vision you painted is still very, very far from implemented, but there are something like adaptive trial, for example, that's already happening somewhat, right? Which is like, you can almost frame it as a RL problem, right? So you try something in cancer, unfortunately, often doesn't work. So then can you quickly switch to second line, third lines, and so forth? And also like from an RL point of view, there are exploitation versus exploration, right? So if you are very certain that this patient will respond to this thing, then you should do the exploitation. But if you are like, oh, I'm not sure, right? So the entropy is so high, my prior is so high, then the exploration makes sense. But to actually do that kind of granularity in an ethical way, in a whole society agreeable way, is still very, very long, right? But the hope is that and also, by the way, I want to also mention what is confounding means, right? So confounding just means it's like, if you assemble a virtual case arm and virtual control arm, what's your nightmare? The nightmare would be, let's say, the case arm maybe accidentally have more healthy people, have more people who are likely to live longer anyway, right? So then the drug is not the only difference between the two crowds, then you have a problem, right? Now, traditionally, how do statistical folks like the pioneer deal with this problem is like you extract a few features and to do this so-called propensity modeling, right? So basically, it's like I try to learn using a bunch of features to predict which people assign this drug versus that drug. Then you try to see, and in a randomized control case, it should be uniform, right? So the feature should not have any predictive power. But if the feature have predictive power, that means you have a bias. Then you can actually reweight the example to adjust some of the bias. But the challenge for that is like you are limited to those few features, right? So there is the famous unknown problem, right? But what if I can collect all kinds of information to compress them into a holistic embedding, and then using that to replace those few features? So disclaimer, we haven't proved that this can work yet, but this is what I think is one of the most accelerating direction. And if we can do this, we can then start to reimagine everything we do in the trial, right? Because I think about a patient like me is a very powerful concept because another problem with clinical trial, if some of you have looked at the clinical trial criteria, right? It's like, let me try to deal with the confounding by divide, right? Maybe some variable could be a confounder, so let's exclude that, like this value, exclude that value. Very soon you have left with no patient. So I'm actually trying to imagine, can we actually go backward? Can we actually include all the information, right? And then using the holistic embedding to deal with those confounding head-on. Right? So,
Okay,
Cool.
For time,
Yeah.
there is food outside, so let me propose we end this here. We can all head outside, and if you have any other questions, please feel free to approach our phone there. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you so much.